As an esports shoutcaster, talent interviewer, host, whatever it is you want to define me as, when the time came to turn this into a legitimate pay my rent job, I needed to be flexible. Coming from a blimp of a country on the gaming radar like South Africa, I actually had to be willing to do various game titles and roles within esports. Because of this flexibility, I've had the opportunity to work on a lot of different productions. I've flown to China to work a Crossfire job on this giant stadium stage with like a drone display to open the show. I've commentated in a tent in the piss pouring rain on e-golf during Made in Denmark, the real golf tournament, with real life golfers playing all around us. I've worked with the best in the global business like ESL, DreamHack, and StarLadder on various events. I've also worked with production companies who knew nothing about esports and so-called specialized esports production companies who knew nothing about production. From one-man production shows to teams of more than 20 people, in my tiny time in the esports industry, with my somewhat conservative career level, I think I've been really lucky to see such a diverse range of productions from the other side, working on them. Despite my job being in front of camera, I very early learned that people behind the camera are actually fundamental to putting on a good show. I also think we don't give the truly great producers and directors enough credit. They don't get the tweet talent announcement saying they're working on a particular show. They don't get a lot of that love after the show. But without them, we'd be screwed. And in all honesty, sometimes because of the less than good ones, we are actually screwed. Esports production has become a passion of mine. It's something that I've considered doing when the time comes to retire from a screen. And it's something I really think doesn't get spoken about enough. So for Tech Girl Talks today, we're going to speak about the intricacies and the magic that production brings to the competitive games and tournaments we love so much. And who better than this guy to take us on that journey?
I'm Jason Baker. I am co-founding managing director of Do Not Peak Entertainment. I started doing esports events just kind of as a hobby with some friends back in 2001. And we used to go to the big Counter-Strike events called CPLs. We just bring our video cameras and record them and make little movies, and it just kind of got more and more involved. And I started doing like online radio station with TSN doing match coverage, and then writing for a website called Got Frag. We eventually got bought by MLG, so I did a lot of broadcasting with MLG back in the day. Scott Smith, my partner here at Do Not Peak, and I started doing lots of stuff for Got Frag and MLG, and we taught them how to actually stream. They didn't know how to stream, so we kind of taught them that. So yes, we're responsible for all those 360 headshot memes. Let's see what else. I went on I did the Counter-Strike Major actually for MLG later on. I was the producer for E-League for the seasons 1, 2, and 3 in the first major. I did not do the second one. I got hired by Blizzard Entertainment to direct their observers. And so I did that for a year, and then I went freelance. I did some Blast Pro series, and now a couple of years ago started my own company with my friend Scott Smith, and we Scott's sticking his head in the door looking at me. We kind of a full service production facility, so we will do white label, we will do our own original content. We're housed in a studio, so we can do pretty much anything.
I've never had the privilege to work with Jason on a production, but I've followed his career for a long time. And I think his insight is invaluable to any aspiring entity looking to enter the world of esports production. I think what is fascinating about Jason and so many of the other great producers and directors I've had the privilege to work with is that many of them didn't come from traditional broadcast backgrounds. Their skill and storytelling ability came from years in the trenches, feeding a passion for sharing esports.
I worked on the giant copier machines, like the ones like bigger than cars, and I would spend every evening doing something in esports, either the online broadcasting or writing up match articles, and then I'd spend all my vacation filming. And so we'd work 16 hours a day making videos every single day. And then when MLG came along, it was my full-time job for a while. And then it actually, when the market crashed in 2008, I went back to I did some system adminning and some programming stuff, and then just a little bit of consulting here and there in esports. And then it just kind of all started kicking back up again when Counter-Strike, CSGO started getting popular again. I started getting lots of job offers to do things.
When I started my esports broadcasting career, I was told by my mentors at the time to watch more sports broadcasts, to watch how the commentators and hosts controlled the flow of the conversation, and to pick on to pick up the subtleties used. At the time, honestly, I thought that was mad. Real sports isn't esports. That's what I was thinking. But looking back, those learning moments were invaluable. And a lot of what I picked up has stuck with me till today. I think the level of production we see at big esports events like the International or a CS Major has found a really unique way to mix traditional broadcast elements with that unique esports flavor. That concoction took some time to develop, though.
We just kind of figured it out. I mean, the old days was way harder. I mean, you'd film to tape and then you'd transfer it to digital. So from that standpoint, you would almost edit in your mind. So if you film something for 2 minutes, it would take 2 minutes just to transfer the footage, and then another minute to conform on the timeline. So you like would get really precise on what you were filming, and that's how I learned observing for Counter-Strike. Because back then, like in 2002, we would film live because it took too long to download the demos at the event because you were on a shared small internet connection. So we would plug into an observer and I would live observe, but I would only record the big moments. So if you looked at a tape from a match, everything that made it into the final video that was like 5 minutes long, like it's just highlights because I just knew where everybody was going and I just was live observing. So yeah, I taught myself. We just, you make something and you look at it with a critical eye to figure out what works, what doesn't work. You get feedback from people you trust, not random people making comments, but actually people that you trust, and you just get better and better. When I went to E-League, I mean, E-League was a whole nother level. I mean, this is Turner Sports. This is an actual broadcast company that does NBA games and everything else. And that was a whole nother level. I mean, from our standpoint, if we did graphics, we would have like 2 or 3 templates, and that's all that we had for the entire broadcast. Where we could constantly make things up on the fly. Um, we're just constantly working on communication and just making the show better and better and getting more and more elements and more replays and stats and just getting a whole production team. There's so many decisions that go into, like, Counter-Strike is like it's round based, so it's like every 2 minutes you need to make a ton of decisions. Are you going to go to replay? Do you go into the reaction shot? Are you going to bring up stats first? Do you have a sponsor plug that you need to do really quick before you get back into the game? Oh, they're going to throw a timeout. What do you do in that timeout? Are you ready for this timeout? Are you ready for a tech pause? And getting an entire team ready to go for that is some of it I knew beforehand, and some of it I really, really learned at E-League just because I worked with some of the best. I had a mentor there named Rodney Triplett, and he did some of the early college football broadcast on Turner from way, way back in the 50s. So here's the difference between TV and esports. In esports, you're looking at people with about 20 years experience tops. You're not going to find much more than that. In TV broadcasting, the person that's teaching you has 50 years of broadcast experience, and he learned from the person who invented it. So it's like there's just so much knowledge and there's so much stuff that's coming at you. Like, I just soaked it up like a sponge. Like, I would go to their other broadcast and watch them work and watch how they all communicate, and I just replicated as much as I could and then made it esporty because we're a little bit different.
We've sort of moved down this weird path now when it comes to productions. I've often had to work with incredibly talented production companies with masses of staff who have no clue what esports is or understand it. They lack a fundamental understanding of the game and don't seem to think it matters because to them, a live show is a live show. Again, this is my experience, and I've also worked with more traditional production who have actively gone out to become experts at the game that will be featured. So finding that mix, though, is I believe where the magic lies.
you need to understand. I mean, the game's king, so you got to understand the game and how to present it properly. When I first walked into E-League, they had commercial breaks 3 rounds into the game. Like they were used to football and basketball, like where they could just like, no, you don't do that. You gotta, it's momentum based. And I taught them how to do that, but they taught me lots of, I mean, if you go back and like look at the E-League Atlanta Major, and every time we're going to a commercial break, just how many cool reaction shots are being thrown in there, how much emotion. It's pretty much telling you, oh, you got to stick around, you got to come back. And then when we come back, it's a couple little clips here and there with, a player's jumping up and cheering, or a big moment in the game, and just tying this back and bringing you back into the game. So I think it's a mix. I mean, you can't. Traditional sports, I think, is boring and stiff. I really think it's stiff. But esports can be very fun and dynamic, but you still got to have all the tools, and you got to have the storytelling techniques. I'll go with Overwatch League. From their replay department, had lots of people with TV show background, and they did not understand the rapid fire replays and emotion and just gathering all this momentum into a 10-second clip. Like there's a lot of work that can go into a 10-second clip, and they definitely were not fast enough or thinking about things the same way. Where at E-League, you just think of how many clips and how much emotion is put in there, because that's the key in esports. If you want to get anybody outside the sport, you got to also catch that human element. I don't know if you've ever watched like the Tetris grand finals, and it's two guys on their face cams, and you watch the Tetris go, and you just start, the Tetris blocks fall. And I don't give a shit about Tetris, but just watching both of these players' faces and how they react to what's going on, like, this guy loses before you see him lose, because he knows he lost, and just the look of defeat on his face, like that shit is so good. I don't know if I can cuss on this broadcast, but that stuff is so good. But like, if you don't know how to capture it or know when those moments are coming, then you failed. So to me, you got to understand the game. You got to understand how to present that game.
For me, the best production teams that I've worked with have always had an incredible understanding of how each of the moving parts work. In fact, whether it be the producer or the sound engineer or the graphic designer or even other talents, I think a vested interest in learning what each person's job is and the intricacies involved allow you to do a better job, because you understand the moving parts and the roles in a live show. Many new people to esports broadcasts, I mean, let's use an example. Say a new shoutcaster, are all in on shoutcasting. They'll watch a stack of shows, follow other shoutcasters as commentators if you're new to esports, and they'll practice every single night. But they don't necessarily understand the stresses or challenges that the producer is facing or the observers. They lack an understanding of what the issues are that could maybe affect the feed they're getting or impact the show. And I think by understanding those details, you have a better handle on how to make sure you can assist in your role, or just have an idea of what needs to be done to fix a certain thing. To illustrate my point, someone like Jason Vega has done it all, which means when he's leading a show, he gets it. In fact, there's actually very little he hasn't done in esports production.
I've done on-air stuff. I've like, so even the CPL events, like I would go and help them set up the computers. I would help them build out the seeds. I would play in some of the tournaments. I would do radio commentating, and then while still producing videos for the thing. So I don't know. I've never gotten rich in esports.
I want to take this a bit further, because I think for anyone looking to produce an esports show or aiming to work in the scene, it really is worthwhile to invest some time in learning some of the other broadcast roles and potentially learning all of them if you want to run a show one day, as Jason explains.
So think of the E-League, just working with Heather and DJ, who are now the top observers in Counter-Strike and even in Valorant. You work with them and you start making sure they understand the pacing and storytelling for TV. So like, all right, this is how you would do it for Twitch. For TV, you would do it this way, and you just play out those moments. And both of them are extremely great at what they do, and it's mostly because they understand the tension and release of storytelling in those games, of somebody's coming up behind them, and he kills them. Where like a lot of people, and some, like, they'll just go, oh, I'm gonna watch this, then watch this, then watch this, watch this, and they're really good at doing those build-ups and then cutting quickly when they need to. So that works really, really good. And then I also know when an observer's being lazy. I know when a talent's being lazy.
I'm really glad Jason brought up observers here, because it's actually a role in most esports broadcasts that I don't think we always give enough focus to. So if you're not familiar with esports broadcasting, let me explain. An observer is ultimately the cameraman or woman who is following the action in game. They're there to capture the moments live to ensure you don't miss the action. So in traditional sports, you'll have a stack of cameramen or women around, plus overhead cameras with the producer shouting to cut to them. So he'll have all those different, or she will have all those different screens, and they'll shout to cut to certain angles, certain cameras, to ensure you see everything as it happens. They're trained on players, those cameras, and in key sports, that the idea is to make sure that everything on the field is translated to your screen. In-game observing is pretty much the same thing. The difference is many productions, especially in smaller regions or on lower budget points, consider observers as an afterthought, again, in my opinion, or simply expect the commentators to observe players in-game while commentating. And again, that comes from experience when I say that. Thinking about a standard game of CSGO where you have 5 players on each team, that's 10 different points of view available at the start of that round. Many other games offer a host of other angle options in-game as well. So now, at any given time, all 10 of those players are doing something the viewer might want to see. And in a live setting, you've got to ultimately read the game, figure out where the action is going to happen, and ensure that you capture it. This is not an easy task, right? I'd actually go so far as to say it is the hardest job for the folks putting together the show, because if you miss the big plays, you're going to have pretty unhappy viewers. And it's easy to toss someone into a game and tell them to observe, but there's a whole new level when you're telling them to observe and expecting them to ensure the action on the screen really grips the viewer.
The observers are number one, because all the cameras can fail, all the graphics can drop, but the viewers will still tune in if you can show the match correctly. It like, even the commentators can drop out and you could still enjoy a match. They're the most important part. That's the first thing that you should build your production around. Back in like 2005 or so, 2005, 2006, we were one of the first companies to actually take observing out of the talent's hands, because everybody else just had the talent do it. And the talent's so focused on what they're talking about, they're not setting up storylines. And it needs to be kind of a back and forth of the talent kind of pushing a storyline and the observers following, or the observers showing a storyline and the talent, enhancing that. And if that back and forth is not happening, it just doesn't work. And the talent being in charge of getting to the next camera position or the next big moment that's coming on while they're talking, it's just too slow. It just doesn't happen. So yeah, it's the first thing that you should hire for, and their pay rate is especially, you think if you're hiring a camera op and it's a special jib camera op, you're going to spend twice the amount for that camera guy. You just will. And observing is the same way. You find somebody that's well trained and you spend more than you would for a graphics position or some other position.
As I've gone on my journey from loving esports as a fan to actually working in front of the camera, I've regularly noticed the difference between a broadcast of people who are great at their jobs and then those that are potentially a bit more slapped together. So I also think when you're in a smaller region or you're working on a title that doesn't necessarily get huge views, it's easy to cut costs when it comes down to certain things. So I've seen this where you cut the cost on the observer because it feels like it's unnecessary. But I've also been on broadcasts where there's been mad budgets and the focus has been on a ridiculously overpriced stage dressed to the nines and these incredible graphic design elements that are coming in, but then no one thought to hire an observer. So when I started out on planning how I wanted this particular Tech Girl Talks episode to go, one of the key things I felt would be important to highlight was that whether you have an esports broadcast with 50 viewers or 100,000, the cost doesn't necessarily scale. In fact, the idea that you should go cheaper if you have less viewers or less interest actually seemed almost silly. And I mean, I know that doesn't make business sense when I say it, But ultimately, to grow a broadcast and put something good out, it comes down to cash. Saying that, I don't think cash necessarily equals success. Like I said, I've seen and worked on broadcasts that cost a fortune to produce, and they've failed miserably for a host of reasons. Jason has and will point out those reasons, as did Richard Lewis in episode 1 of season 2 of Tech Girl Talks, when we spoke about why no one was watching your esports broadcast. But let's just track back quickly. How much does an esports production actually cost to put on?
I mean, you can do it cheap. You can't do it well and cheap. I mean, you can do just one observer with a talent calling in and talking over the footage, but I mean, how often are you going to tune into that? I mean, it's okay for a Tuesday night with nothing else going on, but are you going to watch a big event and then watch it that way? That's just, you're just missing out on all the key components that make a show really nice. From a cost standpoint, it's production is hard. Like, production is hard. Everything has to be planned out in advance, and everybody has to be on the same page. If you have live cameras and a crew of more than 3 people, it has to be perfect. And there's so many details that you have to get right, and so many things that you have to plan for. Like, that takes time and that takes money.
Let's take money out of the equation for a minute. You have an esports event and you want to broadcast. So is it as easy as you think because you've seen Ninja on Twitch streaming his gameplay? Well, the short answer is no. Jason is arguably one of the best at his craft, so I was curious as to what his dream team setup would look like on an esports broadcast.
I'd go with, a director, a TD, producer, assistant director for kind of like a front bitch. You can combine some of those positions, like Europe a lot of times combines the director, and the technical director as one thing. I don't like it on live broadcast, but that's a whole nother story. Observer team always depends on the event. A game like Valorant, I'm going to want 2 to 3 observers, especially depending on how long your day is. If you're going to have a really long day, you're going to want to be able to substitute your main observer in and out. So you're going to want a graphics team, you're going to want an EVS or some sort of video replay. Depending on the team's knowledge of the game, you may need a producer that's doing nothing but producing the replays, because they won't know that this is the big moment, or this is the, you think of how many shortcuts we have in Counter-Strike. If I say, hey, give me that smoke in A, well, if you don't know Counter-Strike, you can't get me that clip, so you may need a producer to help a team get that clip. Same with reaction shots. Oh, give me Forrest and Neo's reaction shots on that 1v1 on 3. You got it. Well, who's Forrest and Neo? Who's like there's all these little things that you got to know. So having a producer helps for that. Then of course, a good talent. That depends on your broadcast as well, but at least a 2 to 3 person desk for analyst desk, and then a great commentary team.
What is interesting is that your producer or director is in charge of ensuring this great show goes out. The buck stops with them. Yet, they have very little say in what the production team around them and who they need to work with actually looks like.
For observers at like E-League, for example, I did have say on the observing team there. At Blizzard, I didn't. I just had to work with who they hired. I was considered the lead, but I didn't even get to interview the other people that were being hired. So that was kind of interesting. Talent, unless it's my own production, I don't. Like here at Do Not Peak, I can hire who I need to for an event, but for something like Turner or third party, I can suggest someone, put their name in there, but even who's casting together it doesn't come up to me. There's always politics. There's agencies that are tied into different broadcasting companies and how they get together and talk about things and say, oh, I want this person to be the finals. And, that's always above my pay grade on hired shows.
Personally, I think producers should actually have a lot more say in the hiring process, but I understand that this isn't always the case. much like any freelance talents or broadcast team members coming onto a job, you need to be flexible. That's actually the second time this word has come up in one of our podcasts on esports. And ultimately, being able to work with different people in high stress situations without losing your cool is part and parcel of the job.
Come show day, you just have to work with, who's available, and the key is then to get them to perform at the highest levels possible. Blizzard, I wasn't in charge of those people, so I didn't have to. I could complain or send emails to my bosses, but if they didn't want to replace them, they're not going to do it. So, talent-wise, it's the same thing. You just work with who they give you, and you just make it work the best you can. Some will put in 100%, and some you got to drag out of the green room so they can get on stage on time.
What we've got here is an understanding that producing esports events and broadcasts is hard. And I do think it's something completely underappreciated by the fans, the sponsors, and even the corporates making the sales calls. I was curious as to what Jason would define as the hardest part of his job.
I think the hardest thing is just the long days, because it's the attention to detail for a 15-hour day every day for 10 days sometimes. You think of the Valorant event that just went on, just how much you have to pay attention to everything and be ahead of everything that's coming up and everything that you're going to do. And then the monkey wrenches of, there's a tech pause or something's broken, and you got to cover for it. A lot of broadcast will just run, the two talking heads will sit there and talk, and you'll show somebody getting their monitor swapped out or whatever, but I always try to do more. I always try to plan. I usually try to get 30 minutes to an hour worth of extra stuff, so if something major happens that I can immediately start going to. Or, then you try to drag your broadcast to, hey, talk about this player, and you start running a B-roll package for them, and then you start showing stats. Those are the little things that make that better, but it's lots of concentration, lots being prepared, and working very long days.
Off on a tangent time, I once desk hosted a show that had all the bells and whistles. We were talking fancy overlays, great transitions, all the goodies. But the thing we didn't have, that extra content. I remember in the rehearsal bringing it up and letting the production team know that in the past, working on this specific title in this specific country we were working, we had big delays with getting players into the server. I asked if we had a backup plan or like a fail-safe for this, especially as we were all working remotely. We spoke for a bit, but nothing was really put into place. Blow me down if on the live show we have a delay and there's a player that can't get into the server. So here I was with my two panelists doing the pre-match chat that was scheduled for about 10 minutes. 60 minutes later, we were still on. No breaks, no filler content, no B-roll, just 3 talking heads. Now, in all fairness, my job is actually to handle those situations. That's what I'm meant to do. And I think the entire on-camera crew in this particular instance did just that. But in the back of my mind, while this was all going on, there was this whisper going, told you so. A few times since I've asked production about the extra full content available, and more often than not, I've been told, there's no budget for things that aren't confirmed for broadcast. That's always the thing. If we're not going to use it, we're not going to pay for it. Which is, again, something I think we miss when we're putting these productions together. Even if it's even if it never sees the light of day, best believe you need it, and can probably use it somewhere.
A lot of the packages I prepare will make it on or have showed up at another time in the broadcast. It just comes down to knowing what you have in your arsenal. I'm not scared to have somebody do 2 hours of work on graphics and packages that I never use. There's often times that it happens. It's just part of being prepared. So, it's 50-50.
We've broken down what esports production is and what it should ideally elicit when it comes to feelings and emotions. But is there something that regularly happens on live productions that could be worked on? Is there maybe that one thing we all need to toss out and never use again? I have a few things that bug me, but I do think it becomes different no matter who you speak to.
You know what? I wouldn't say that there's just one. I think everybody has their own little Achilles heel or their own little problem to nitpick here and there. It's gotten a lot better over the last couple of years, but sometimes it's the getting out to the players to catch that victory celebration. People get so caught up on having this fancy transition and doing the sound effects, and maybe the TD doesn't understand that the game is actually over, and that communication channel is too long. So missing that big moment on live, I think is the thing that drives me the most nuts. Having just, I think, poor observing will do it, or not a quite focus on what that observing team should be doing. Sometimes they'll have requirements to show off a product, like, oh, this is this new skin, we got to make sure to show this a lot, and you get so caught up on trying to do these little things that you can't do your actual job. I can see that kind of crop up here and there.
Whether you're part of a live production team of 10 or more people, or maybe you're just aiming to showcase your shoutcasting skills from your bedroom, there's some key takeaways from a brain like Jason Baker's, and things you can implement in not only an esports production, but in your productions in general. It all comes down to one thing, and it's the thing that keeps cropping up in all of these Tech Girl Talks podcasts that are centered around esports and the entertainment value of it.
I would say how to tell the story of the game. That is just, it's all tied in. That is just the number one thing I think of, from observing all the way down to what the camera work is doing, to what the casters are talking about, to what the graphics are on the screen. Get people invested in the game. Why is this match important? What stakes are on the line? When there's all these A, B, and C stories that you can just tie together. Oh, player A used to be on this other team. Now they're playing against each other and they have their very first gun round. Well, being on that player can kind of bring up that tension, and then it'll pan out or it won't. If it doesn't, you just kind of go with the flow and move away from that storyline and add on to a new one. The main director I worked with at E-League used to always have this question. His name was Steve Daly. And he used to always have this question that was, what is the purpose? And that would make you really think about why you're doing something. Are you doing something just because you think it looks cool? Okay, just admit it, that you're only doing it because you look cool. Or does it serve the broadcast in a certain way? Does it serve storytelling? And it's something I always do think every time we do something is, what's the purpose? Why are we doing this?
You've been listening to Tech Girl Talks, a Playlyst original. This podcast deep dives into topics around esports and gaming that aim to highlight my passion and the passion of so many others involved in these industries. If you've enjoyed the discussions, please share the podcast or reach out to me. I'm at TechGirlZA on most social media to let me and others know. Tech Girl Talks is available on all good podcasting streaming services. I also host a Tech Girl Talks More live stream at 1 p.m. SAST every Thursday on twitch.tv/TechGirlZA. If you feel you have something you want to add to the conversation, come and join us there.